So, David, there's so much to discuss, and in keeping with the model, let's continue this conversation, because I guess you were probably listening to a little bit of it, and the way that this kind of double standard on how politics gets into the conversation when we're talking about disaster relief. For just perspective, David, I don't know if you know this. I live very, very close to where these fires are in the Palisades. I'm in Palisades a lot. My son went to school there. His school burned down. So he wasn't there. He's gone. He's graduated. But the point is that I have proximity to a disaster like I've never had before, and to hear this, it pierces even worse when you hear the Tommy Tubervilles and the Republicans talk about it in this way.
Well, especially given that he's from a welfare state. California sends far more money to Washington than it gets back in government services and contracts, whereas Alabama is a welfare state. So that's particularly galling. But this is a new development that started with Donald Trump. We'll provide money to our friends and not to our enemies, and is in sharp contrast to Joe Biden saying, I'm the president of all the people. And in fact, more money from the Inflation Reduction Act went to red states than blue, as absolute proof of that. And Biden, in, I think, a mistake, in my view, would allow senators and congresspeople who voted against funding to come to the ceremonial first shovel with President Biden. And they would talk about, oh, well, I brought all this money to my constituents, which was just a complete lie. They didn't want to bring it at all. And this is not the first time we've seen that, however good he may have been as a football coach, Tommy Tuberville doesn't know anything. I mean, in that regard, he's very much like Donald Trump. His ignorance is unmeasurable. It is so large. It's like the known universe. You just can't conceive of anything that big.
Yeah. Howell Heflin, who was a senator from Alabama for many, many years, he sort of bridged that, the new, I mean, he was there for such a long time. He was a Supreme Court judge there, but he bridged an era of Democratic politics from the old South to the new South. And then, of course, no Democrat could be elected. He said, once I remember somebody asked him if there's any way that he could lose. And he said, well, only if the coach of Alabama is running against me. Well, Tuberville was the coach of Auburn, and that may be the only way that he could have beaten even Doug Jones, who had only beaten Roy Moore by just a very little bit. And I think talking about Doug Jones is a good segue into talking now about, before we leave storms, what about Sandy? To me, you said it started more recently under Trump, but I feel like it started during Hurricane Sandy relief. Am I mistaken for thinking that way?
Well, every big disaster we've had back at least to the hurricane that hit New Orleans in August of 2005, we've seen this rising aspect, but it comes from the Republicans. I have not heard any significant Democrat say, oh, we should check your political views before we decide if you get money from the federal government. Now, there's a reasonable argument to be made, should the government at all be in the business of helping after natural disasters? I think the answer to that should be yes, of course we will do that. That's one of the things a country does to take care of its citizens. But if you want to debate that, let's have a debate about that, but certainly not, well, you didn't vote for our party, so no money for you. I'm reminded here of a social event that I went to once, and one of my children, who was then, I think, 9 years old, went and got a plate and got in line to eat after the event, and the plate was snatched away from her by the hostess, who said, this is only for our side of the family. I mean, who does that?
Wow.
And now we're seeing people like this in public life. They don't have any regard for Americans. And you will see steadily in Donald Trump's comments and in comments of various people on Fox that you're either with Donald Trump or you're not worthy.
Yeah.
And I was watching earlier today parts of the confirmation hearing for Pete Hegseth. And Richard Blumenthal, the former Attorney General of Connecticut, very smart prosecutor, said, I would support you to be the Pentagon spokesman, but you're not qualified to be head of the Defense Department, which prompted Senator Mullen from Oklahoma to then assert that nobody who was a senator was qualified to hold any appointed position. They just got lucky and got elected, including himself. But, we're getting into this absurd realm instead of dealing with realities. Hegseth was asked by one of the women senators, I believe Jean Shaheen from New Hampshire, but I may be wrong. There is a law that says that women must be treated equally in the military. They must be trained for combat. We have women, been through Ranger School and SEAL School, et cetera. And will you obey the law and see to it? And remember, Hegseth says he doesn't want any women in combat. So what does Hegseth say as an answer? Well, I will absolutely look into that, consistent with the positions of America First and the policies of the incoming president, which is his way of saying, of course, I'm not going to do that. Right. I am going to eliminate women. And this is a test by Donald Trump of how many Republicans will risk being voted out of office by rejecting a manifestly unqualified candidate, who, by the way, also took his hearing as an opportunity to say, this is all a coordinated smear campaign by lefty media, ignoring, a police report. He wouldn't even agree to a further FBI inquiry questioning his accountants, his ex-wives, other people. Well, I'm sorry, if all of this is untrue, you didn't rape or try to rape any women, why would you object to the FBI looking into this? Right. I'm perfectly happy to have somebody investigate all the rape cases involving me, because there aren't any.
Right. I think, just the fact that now that people are talking about how the FBI didn't do a good enough investigation into this makes it plain. And I think that Tim Kaine at least insinuated the same, that there's stuff out there that the Senate is not sharing, that we know,
right,
that Hegseth himself obviously knows, and the threat of that being released doesn't seem to be moving.
And remember, this is what happened in the Brett Kavanaugh hearing.
Yeah,
we had Susan, I think her name was Susan Ford, come forward and tell about Brett Kavanaugh assaulting her when they were in high school. Well, I'm willing to pass over something in high school or college if it was a stupid thing you did when you were young. But it's been credibly reported that there were thousands of tips from women, their friends, their spouses, about other assaults by Brett Kavanaugh over his lifetime, all of which the Trump administration kept from going to the Senate. In this case, the background report on Pete Hegseth has been available, but they won't let the Democrats see it. That's not how the Constitution envisions how things function. It is one of the many signs that we are heading towards the end of our democracy. If Trump has the skill, and I'm not sure he does, to pull it off to become America's dictator, Emperor Donald.
Yeah. And again, this is advise and consent. You hear about it all the time. This committee is meant to do all the work they can in the old construct of how this came about, and then report their findings before C-SPAN existed and we could all sit and watch it, report their findings to the whole Senate. It's changed a lot since C-SPAN. I think C-SPAN's a great thing. I think cameras in government have been great, but there are they don't come without deficits. And I think this is a deficit, this grandstanding, this, if this was happening in a room without cameras, you would be getting different questions, you'd be getting different answers, and you would also have, I think, a little bit more courage from senators.
Well, and also, Mike, I think it's important to keep in mind that this isn't unique to politicians who preen in front of the cameras. Right. I've written pieces about journalists who do this. Back during the invasion of Iraq, there were daily briefings by Donald Regan when he was the Donald Regan, who was the defense secretary.
Regan was
Rumsfeld. Donald Rumsfeld.
Donald Rumsfeld.
I'm sorry, Donald Rumsfeld.
Regan was Reagan.
This was Donald Rumsfeld when he was defense secretary. And there was a reporter who asked this question, and he backs into it, and then he tells you how much he knows and then how smart he is and brings up something else that's marginally relevant. And finally, he gets to the question, and Donald Rumsfeld says, that is the worst, he may have even said, stupidest question I've ever heard, and it was badly asked. And I remember flying out of my chair and going, yes, you just ask the question.
Right.
Get to the point. Don't offer 15 off-ramps for the person to not answer your question. That's
Right.
why
and
it's
nobody needs
very important.
your own bona fides for asking the question. You're the reporter asking the question. Yeah.
Right. And it goes to how much we are worse off for not having Katie Porter in the Senate. I mean, Adam Schiff's going to be a great senator, but she would have been a really good inquisitor. And Al Franken, who was driven out by Kirsten Gillibrand, one of my senators in New York, over nonsense. The people who are in comedy engage in all sorts of ridiculous play as part of what they do. And I have a daughter who was part of the stand-up brigade, or whatever it's called, of people who do comedy on stage in New York, and I went to a sort of rehearsal practice, try things out once. And as her father, I was uncomfortable. Okay. But I also understood this is how you come up with skits and things. You try things, you do silly things, you don't have any limits, and then you decide what's acceptable to an audience. And we instead are getting a lot of questions asked by senators that are designed either to take away from any serious discussion of the issues, or that don't press and say, that's not an answer, sir. And that's where Katie Porter and Al Franken were superb. They really knew how to ask the killer question.
Yeah, no, there's no question. And I would say, I mean, to a lesser extent, I wouldn't put her in the same. I think Vice President Harris, when she was in the Senate, was very, very good at asking questions when she was a senator.
She was. I agree with you. She was an excellent. She did an excellent job asking questions when she was a senator.
Yeah, but again, it is now it's now a show. These confirmation hearings are shows. They are drawing lines, and I think that the people that are not qualified generally get out before they make it to the Senate floor, and that's not how it always used to be. And we'll see where these go. Does this mean that Hegseth is confirmed? No, but I think if you don't have Joni Ernst, as we said, the math becomes much more difficult for those who don't want him to be secretary. I want to talk to you, David, about news that was made yesterday when Jack Smith released part of his report. I want to know a little bit about why it's important that we know these things. And whether or not it's just so damn frustrating that we'd rather not know. And we, does it put an exclamation point on our frustration with Merrick Garland?
Well, Merrick Garland, like Robert Mueller, proved to be a very unfortunate choice in the sense that, while fully qualified, they were both such Boy Scouts that they didn't understand they were dealing with someone who's the exact opposite of that. And they didn't adjust to address that. And delay after delay after delay, once the case was brought against Trump, the two cases by the federal government, but those should have been brought right away. I mean, on January 21st, 4 years ago, Merrick Garland should have said, here, I need a team of people to investigate Donald Trump, and I want to hear back in 60 days, we can or can't charge him. And it's unfortunate what happened. I think that in the one case where Trump was convicted, the New York hush money case, and therefore manipulation of the election, that it's unfortunate that Judge Marchand didn't handle the hearing where he sentenced Trump differently. I understand why he said, I'm not going to impose a penalty, at least in terms of probation or incarceration, because Trump's about to take office. But he could have fined him. But more importantly, he could have said, given the unusual circumstances of this case, I think it's important to know what I would have done but for the Supreme Court decision. And then, if he was going to give him prison time, he should have said so. Now, he would be severely criticized for that. The Trump people would, without a doubt, have tried to get him removed from the bench if he did that. because it doesn't conform with judicial norms. But the obvious defense of that would be this is a very unusual circumstance, and we're going to regret that Donald Trump did not get what he deserved, which was conviction and imprisonment for the crimes he's been committing his whole life, but in particular, the two federal cases, the Georgia case that's still on hold, and the New York case.
Yeah, I really agree with you. I was thinking, I was sort of segueing from Tuberville to Doug Jones, and Doug Jones was he was a senator there for just a moment after Jeff Sessions had been put in cabinet by Donald Trump. Doug Jones was former U.S. attorney, prosecuted the Alabama bombing, and he seemed like somebody who was about to be the attorney general, save for the fact that Joe Biden promised that he would nominate an African-American woman to the Supreme Court, had to sort of put her on a court, vacate a seat, and elevated Merrick Garland so that Ketanji Brown Jackson could take that seat on the circuit court. So what I think is that if Doug Jones had been there, and we can think this as much as we want, it doesn't matter, but there are prosecutors who could have been in the position of attorney general, who would have gone after Donald Trump much harder and maybe more quickly and less deliberately, and given a better, I guess, a better outcome to some of these cases more quickly.
Yes, oh, absolutely. And I think it's more than reasonable to criticize Garland for just being too formal and cautious.
Yeah.
He's not a bad guy. He's a very good guy. He was an excellent judge. I've read some of his opinions. They're solidly reasoned work on complex issues. Yeah. But he didn't understand who he was dealing with, which is the third generation head of a 4-generation crime family, not a crime family like the mafia where they kill people and break legs, but a white collar crime family that steal with broken promises, ink pens, and lawyers. And he just didn't understand who he was dealing with and didn't apparently have the resolve to push this much earlier. And Jack Smith made one big mistake. They made a decision to file the documents case in Florida. The Constitution says that you will be prosecuted in the district, there are 90 judicial districts in the country, in the district where your crime occurred. Well, the crime wasn't depositing the documents in Florida. The crime was taking them from Washington, D.C., and then there were subsequent crimes where Trump and his lawyers knowingly lied and denied and hid documents. Those are additional charges. They could have brought a third case, or they could have incorporated them in the D.C. case. They apparently were concerned that the Supreme Court would delay the proceedings while Trump argued, if you're going to charge me, you have to do it in Florida. And I think that was, in retrospect, a huge mistake, especially given that Trump got Judge Cannon, a highly likely nominee for the next Supreme Court opening, even though she's demonstrated her utter lack of fitness for that position. So do you want to talk at all about the fires, by the way?
Yeah, we're going to get the fires. There was some breaking news yesterday with Jack Smith. I'm going to get to the fires. I want to ask one follow-up to what you just said. Yeah. Was there anything to do you think, with making whatever happened pardon-proof and also an assumption that Trump could never be elected again?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know. I mean, I haven't thought about the pardon-proof side of this. Had Trump been convicted in any of these cases, he wouldn't be in the White House. We would not be facing the disaster we're about to face. I don't think there's any question about that. And the argument that Trump makes that, they were prosecuting me so I wouldn't be in the White House again, well, let's assume that's true. What does that have to do with anything? If you're a criminal, if you have stolen national security secrets, not a couple of documents for which, people have gone to jail over taking home one document overnight and returning it, but taking them wholesale and then revealing secrets to people. So what? That's the real issue, that you behaved in a way disloyal to the U.S. And I think it's unfortunate that none of the Democrats were willing to challenge Trump's running for president on the grounds that he is an insurrectionist and is barred under the 14th Amendment's third clause which says anyone who gave aid or comfort to an insurrection, you don't have to be an insurrectionist, gave aid or comfort to an insurrection, is ineligible to hold any government office.
Yeah. Agreed. All right. I'm glad. I just wanted to ask that to you. And yes, we can come back here to the Golden State and talk about fires. Did you want to talk about how politicized they've become, or about what the financial impact to state and country is, or both?
Well, I want to give a little political context to this. I lived in LA for almost 10 of the 12 years I worked for the Los Angeles Times. I was up in San Francisco, the other part. In 1980, John Gerard, the fire chief of LA, gave a talk in which he said that the city did not have adequate fire trucks and equipment for a conflagration. He warned that a fire that started in the foothills could sweep down into the flat areas, both on the ocean side of the city and in the San Fernando Valley, and that they would probably, in such a circumstance, be required to use dynamite to blow up blocks of houses to create a fire break. That story didn't appear in the LA Times because the editor in question said that it was alarmist and just an effort to get more money for his budget. Well, look what happened. It took 45 years, but exactly what he worried about happened. And it wasn't like nobody knew this would happen. In 1955, when I was 6 years old, I lived on my grandmother's orange ranch in Orange at the time. I watched the live broadcast by the legendary TV reporter Clete Roberts of the Bel Air fire and the houses that were burned. And the first time I learned about cedar shake roofs. Grandma, what's a cedar shake roof and why these contribute to fires? And they're still all over LA. They're now supposedly treated with fire retardants, but nonetheless, they're wood. Yeah. So this issue of underfunding the fire department is an old issue. It is not a new issue. When Jennifer and I lived on Mount Washington, we had a shack. It's all it was. But it was on the top of Mount Washington, which is the road to the left if you're going up the Pasadena Freeway from downtown to Pasadena. It's the mountain on the left where the Southwest Museum is. We practiced escape routes if there was a fire, because it's a very steep, it's 800 feet above sea level, and a fire at the bottom could race up to the top literally in a couple of minutes. And so people are aware there's this fire danger. There's not a lot to be done about that except for building houses that are not intended to burn. And you'll see in the photographs that there are houses that did not burn because they had xeriscaping. Instead of various things in the yard, they had rocks and rock gardens, and plants were kept at a certain distance. There are stands of trees still up in Pacific Palisades that weren't burned by the fire, where there are buildings that are gone. There's a lot that could have been done to fund firefighting, to put underground reservoirs aside. The system isn't designed, to draw all the water needed to fight all these fires. So, of course, water pressure falls and reservoirs go dry. But there could have been more done. But you know what? The taxpayers of LA and California, they didn't want to do that. They wanted lower taxes. They didn't want to spend money on a speculative fire that might come someday. And that's part of the core of this. We're not prepared for things. And now that we have climate change, now we have the Chinese hoax, right, according to Donald Trump. Yeah. We're seeing these things come home to roost, and this is not over. There will be next year and the year after that. And what will follow the fires we have right now? They're going to be mudslides, because the basins below the mountains, they're basically debris fields. Those huge boulders you can go out and see northwest of downtown, those are come down from the mountains from past storms. And so we're going to have mudslides. We're going to find out that a lot of people didn't update their insurance. When we had the fires in Ladera Heights, which was a mostly black neighborhood off Crenshaw Boulevard, a number of the owners up there had not updated their insurance from even the 1950s, if I recall, and therefore insurance companies didn't have to pay them. There's a law that, if you don't have proper insurance, I insure my house to the maximum extent State Farm will allow me, and I pay for what's called code insurance. The building codes have changed, and code upgrades and rebuild. And if I didn't do that, I would save $90 a year. Doesn't make sense, people doing dumb things like that. So you're going to see it's going to be very difficult to get fire insurance in California. It's not
you
going to be
mentioned State Farm. They're not even in California. They said we're not writing any more policies in California at all. Before
and these problems are not limited to Southern California. I grew up in Santa Cruz. I was sure during the fire in 20 or 21 that my house I used to own in the Bonnie Doon area up in the Redwood Forest was going to be gone. The fire stopped at the hill just before it got to the house. But back then, the authorities warned that a fire from up in the Bonnie Doon Hills, that's where the University of California, Berkeley is, University of California, Santa Cruz is, could sweep down into the city and burn all the way to the ocean. Has any fundamental reform taken place since then? No, because human beings aren't very good at, that might happen in the future, but it's not affecting what I'm doing today, and I don't want to pay any more taxes. So, we need to look at ourselves about things like this, and we need to think smarter, and we need to listen to the people like the late Fire Chief John Gerard when they warn us that this is what the engineering tells us, this is what the science tells us.
Right.
And as a general rule, we're not doing that.
And whoever the editor was, I love the criticism that the fire chief was being alarmist. Well, if anybody has a right to be alarmist, they're called fire alarm.
It's a fire chief.
It's a fire chief, right? I mean, so.
And Michael, the death rates from fires in the U.S. compared to the late 19th century, so 125 years ago, are vastly lower today. They're vastly lower than they were 100 years ago because we did listen to fire engineering. So buildings have sprinklers in them. New York City, famously, the city council agreed to give all sorts of waivers for buildings that don't have sprinklers in them. If you go in Manhattan, up Amsterdam or one of the broad roads that runs the length of the island, you will see all of these 4, 5, 6, 7-story apartment buildings. If you look very carefully, you will notice that the outdoor fire escapes often run down in front of specific apartments instead of the window in the hallway facing the street. And what that means is if there's a fire in that building and you're on the X floor and the person whose apartment is where the escape is and they're gone, you're going to die in that fire. Right. Because they didn't put them in front of the big windows, they put them next to somebody's apartment. Right. This is idiocy of the first order, and it's not like we don't know what to do here. But the notion that we shouldn't help Californians because, as Tommy Tuberville said, well, it's not all Californians, it's just those liberals who voted for these idiots. That's his words, not mine. Yeah. That's offensive, and hopefully it won't become policy, but I'm very concerned it may well become policy under this administration.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I would put nothing past this administration, and to talk about one other thing with the fires. In the 1980s, there was this movement, the Let Malibu Burn movement, which I would guess that you remember. But the premise being that nature does this. Fires start, they burn brush, and then brush grows again. We're just living there now, and we are victims to that. So when a house burns down, don't allow it to be rebuilt in that area, because this is just going to keep happening over and over again.
Indeed, we've known widely, at least since the mid-'70s, the LA Times carried a big story by one of my colleagues in the mid-'70s about fire as a natural part of the Western United States. The indigenous peoples, long before Europeans came, used to set fires on purpose because they led to new growth. They led to certain kinds of seeds not opening. They'd lay there on the ground for decades, and then when a fire came, they would pop open and they would begin to repopulate. So we're not respecting this sort of natural condition of the environment. You can still build in areas like that, but if you do so, you have to do it with the thought to, well, what happens when there is a fire? How do we minimize the risk of a fire? And so you don't want to build wood frame houses. You don't want to have roofs that are other than metal or Spanish tile, things like that. You want to keep shrubbery at a distance. and you want to have plans to, if necessary, wet that property. You have a swimming pool, have a system.
Yeah.
All of that costs money to do, but you have to adapt to the environment or suffer the consequences of not adapting.
It's very true. David K. Johnston, obviously I could sit here and talk to you all day, but you can't do that and I can't do that. We have another guest and we have news.
Yep.
And we have Pete Hegseth. And so there's a lot to cover. It's one of the privileges of being able to guest host this is to visit with you and on Tuesday. So I'll always make sure I can do it Tuesday when Mark asks.
Nice to be with you, Michael. Have a wonderful week. Take care.
You too.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell, you'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.